Welcome back, Giacomo. Welcome back, everyone. We're happy to see that many of you have returned for our third session of Democracy in America. Can everybody hear me okay? I just do have a quick announcement. We do need to end promptly at 8 p.m. tonight due to unforeseen circumstances, but we will have a strong hour of programming with this conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Giacomo. Giacomo, thanks for being here. Welcome back. I think you're muted, Giacomo.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again, Kristen. And just one quick thing I want to say. I apologize if I sound a little winded. I literally just hopped off a Zoom meeting that I had to lead that had over 90 people on it. It's the first of quite a few that I'm going to be having in the next 24 hours. I apologize for that. And I have learned the hard way that it is much easier to breathe during these marathons if I am standing. So if you don't mind, we do have visuals for you. We have these PowerPoints right over here. I'm just going to turn off the camera so that I'm able to stand and lecture and not paint. If there's no objections, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, thank you all so much. Just adjusting this a little bit. Is everyone able to hear me clearly? Yep. All right, thank you all so very much. So let's see, we have 15 participants coming in. As usual, we usually start about 5 minutes after the hour, so I would just wait a little bit. I did receive some emails from you, so thank you so much. If anyone who is here submitted an email, can you please, you have the floor. Let us know what you were writing about and what in particular inspired you to write it. In that case, anybody here have any questions or any feedback or any thoughts on anything that we've discussed thus far? In that case, since this is being recorded, I guess for the library's records, does anybody have any thoughts on the current state of democracy in America? Both the book and the noun. Well, let me just say that a little bit less than 4 years ago, in January of 2017, I actually wrote an op-ed for the Huffington Post where I advised everyone, it was right before the presidential inauguration, I advised everyone in the op-ed to write themselves a letter where they were simply describing who they are, what the United States is like at that moment, and what their thoughts and what their fears were for the country moving forward. And I advised everyone to write that because it was my impression that quite a few people would think we'd be living in a different country. Some would say 24 hours from then, others would say 4 years from then. It is now 4 years later, and I have no doubt that if we had written ourselves a letter of how things were 4 years ago, we might be reading it like someone from a different country for whatever reason, regarding COVID, what have you. So with that said, I just want to say that I appreciate this opportunity to be able to present and also for the library to be recording this discourse on democracy in America in these few hours before the 2020 presidential election. And I do want to say that we're very indebted to the library for them to have these resources that they can be facilitating during this very difficult time for everyone. During these times where I can say travel would probably make it impossible for me to be there. We have snow over here in Herkimer. I don't know if you've had it over there in Albany in the capital region, but if you do, of course, please be very safe if you do plan on voting tomorrow. And Kristen, any thoughts before we begin today's discussion? Anything you would like to add?
No, I just wanted to comment that, you know, it's so timely. Your question of our impressions of democracy today, it's just so timely. I mean, we're getting ready to vote tomorrow if you haven't already, and it's important. It's so important that we're getting the opportunity to have these conversations, here facilitated by the library.
Yes, without a doubt. And of course, Kristen, moving forward when it comes to this program and everything afterwards, if there's anything more that we can be doing to help our local library, help our local librarian, help our local educator, anyone during these times, This might be the most challenging winter in our lifetime, possibly the most challenging winter for our country in a century, maybe longer. And I've always viewed, in my opinion, I've always viewed the library as the moment where a town becomes a community. So if there's anything more that we could do for your library, please let us know. As always, we are happy to help.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, so let's go into Democracy in America, Part 3, Associations. So I did receive an email, as I mentioned, from some of you. And what was very interesting is one of the emails didn't even go into any particular commentary. They just sent a passage that really stood out to them, what really resonated. So I was wondering if someone, because I am, as I said, somewhat winded right now, could we have a volunteer please read this passage that was shared for us to discuss via email? Volunteer, please. You can unmute yourself.
I'm happy to do it, Giacomo, if we don't have anyone else. The great advantage of the Americans is that they have arrived at a state of democracy without having to endure a democratic revolution, and that they are born equal instead of becoming so.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, let's take this on its surface. Let's say that this maxim is a cadaver. It's about 200 years old. We have it on a table. It's dead. It was written 200 years ago. Its author is no longer alive. The audience is no longer alive. The country that he was describing, some would say, has changed so much that it's no longer the country that he was writing about. So let's criticize this. In your opinion, do you believe that America today has never endured a democratic revolution? Yes or no? Let's think about it.
I'm not sure what a democratic revolution is.
Well, a democratic revolution could, let's define it as any major political or societal upheaval that changed the American electorate to a point that it no longer resembled its former self.
I think we've had a lot of democratic revolutions over the years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so might say maybe the passage of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, maybe the Civil Rights Act. It's worth mentioning that Tocqueville himself was living through what was called a bit of a populist revolution when it came to non-landowners participating in the vote. So we do have that. Of course, we could even view the inclusion of, without a doubt, the passage of the 19th Amendment more than doubled the amount of eligible voters in the country, while at the same time, unfortunately, did not grant the vote to so many. I believe it was about, about 3 million African American women in the South during the time, who, due to Jim Crow laws, unfortunately, would not be able to vote until the 1960s. But let's think about let's challenge this even more. So we've talked about political revolutions. Let's look at a revolution of the people by the people. Do any of you consider the American Civil War to be a revolution?
Yes.
Yes. Who else thinks so?
I think so.
All right. Was this a revolution simply for the Confederacy, or was this a revolution for both players? The Union and the Confederacy.
It was a revolution over slavery, which would have been, I think, both parties taking different sides.
Yeah, to quote Shelby Foote, who some of you might know from Ken Burns' The Civil War, Shelby Foote said, many Americans like to proudly think that they're uncompromising, that we have ideals that are not compromising. He said that's actually not true at all. He said Americans are incredibly compromising. In some cases, we're famous for great compromises. We're famous for our Constitution and for our Congress. And what he said is that the one thing we weren't able to compromise on was slavery. And unfortunately, it was truly fatal. We ended up, there's more, they say that as of this recording, they say over 700,000 Americans died during the American Civil War. A few years from now, it might be 800,000. It always seems to be higher when it comes to the amount. And Abraham Lincoln himself, he did view the Civil War as a revolution. He did not believe he would be able to restore the Union as it was. And he says that we need a new birth of freedom, a new country. And it really does seem that while the Union does win the war, while politically there is a continuity in terms of the federal government and the Secretary of State, make no mistake, with the passage of the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments, we are a radically different country. And a major part of it has to do with who exactly has rights that they're born into. And even with those advancements, we still see an enormous blind spot. Actually, no, that's an understatement. We see an injustice for the countless women in the country during this time period who, while Alexis de Tocqueville may champion that this is a country where people are born equal instead of becoming so, that it looks like he wasn't thinking revolutionary enough for what America would become. And some of the comments we have over here, Kristen, of course, yes, the Civil War was a revolution, brother versus brother. Virginia, both sides had to fight, although there was no doubt a variety of reasons on both sides. And Andrew, who submitted this email, thank you so much. Yes, in a sense that Blacks joined and fought for the Union Army as a kind of rebellion leading to revolution. Andrew, for starting this discussion with this email, which I am grateful for, do you have any additional comments on these passages that you selected from Tocqueville's writing that you would just like an additional comment on before we go forward? What inspired you to share this with us? Are you there? Well, I guess we'll get to it. Silence is golden. So, when it comes to, oh yes, Andrew, he wrote that, just tried to select the best quotes. Yes, very well chosen, sir. You did choose quite a few that we will be getting into. So without further ado, we will begin the presentation then. I do want to say, though, that when it comes to this particular section, I believe this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is, what is this? This is, yes, Volume 2, Book 2, Section 3, Individualism. We do go into a little bit more detail here when it comes to despotism. Since this was already selected for discussion, we'll just go forward with the discussion. So when it comes to Volume 2, Part 2 of Democracy in America, it's going to be here that we are discussing the influence of democracy on the sentiments of the Americans. So starting off over here, I'm going to read this. This is from Chapter 1, Love of Equality versus Love of Liberty. And I do want to say this relationship between the two. When I was an undergraduate at Susquehanna University in Pennsylvania, I studied government with a local office holder, and she had run for office several times, had won, and had retired from politics. And it was very interesting, even though politically she was very different from quite a few of the students, she did give us a very nice explanation of what was the two-party system. She said from her perspective, the difference between the right or the left or the liberal, conservative, democratic, republic, what have you, is she said that she felt that it really boiled down to, and not only the United States, but in other countries such as Great Britain, a difference between those who were more interested in pursuing equality through government and those who were most interested in pursuing liberty. It was a very interesting way of breaking down what could be considered liberal or conservative politics, simply in the sense of equality or liberty being a greater priority. Again, just one woman's perspective, but it was very Tocquevillian of her to be sharing that insight. So this passage that I have over here, the first and most intense passion, which is engendered by the equality of conditions, again, this is Tocqueville, he loves the equality of conditions, is, I need hardly say, the love of that same equality. My readers will therefore not be surprised that I speak of it before all others. Everybody has remarked that in our time, and especially in France, that passion for equality is every day gaining ground in the human heart. It has been said 100 times that our contemporaries are far more ardently and tenaciously attached to equality than to freedom. But as I do not find that the causes of the fact have been sufficiently analyzed, I shall endeavor to point them out. He then says, the principle of equality may be established in civil society without prevailing in the political world. So let's start with this. Is it possible, in your opinion, for a society to establish themselves or even establish the benefits of equality without any politics? This is a chicken and the egg question. Is it possible for equality to be established in a civilized society without politics?
I think no.
All right, so we have you think no. Andrew over here writes, for some, it is about freedom instead of democracy. I have a question. You who said no. Who are you? Who's on no? Yes, who said no?
That was Susan. Sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see the label on there. Susan, please expand upon that. Why do you disagree?
Well, because I think that when people do not have equality, that we have to change the laws so that it helps us. Women's rights, voters' rights, equal opportunity under many laws and rules and regulations. I don't think it's going to happen without the political world getting involved.
Mm-hmm. That is a very fair assessment. It's also something that there's factors that politics aren't able to control when it comes to inequality. For example, we're not going to be able to change the fact that the planet has different seasons that affect different parts of the world differently when it comes to climate, when it comes to environment. We're not going to be able to change the fact that some people are taller than others, that we have people of different races, different identifications and genders, etc. So with all that said, even in those situations, Tocqueville believes that equality can be established simply almost among something akin to a barter system, rather than a need for politics to be there. Although at the same time, when it comes to the New World, as I said, there's a fantastic book that came out recently from Princeton University Press. And let me just check. Yes, I have it right over here. The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today by David Stasavage. I mentioned this last week, if I'm not mistaken. In there, they made it very clear that according to more accurate and more recent studies, that it appears that democracies were as common around the entire world as monarchies and autocracies. And the main example that he says is that the New World was rich, if not with pure democracies or republics, but with basically governments or even just standards or alliances that were much more closely founded on equality than what would be replacing them when it came to the United States, specifically when it came to Native American tribes, indigenous people, their alliances, some of their codes that, without a doubt, when compared to the aftermath of the conquest of the New World, North and South America, that they were much more equal before the arrival of the Europeans. Any other comments on this? Let's see, we have from Matthew, equality of what? Opportunity or outcome? I would probably say, in this case, it would probably be equality of opportunity, if I'm reading Tocqueville correctly. And from Gail, Gail writes, in theory, a benevolent dictator could ensure equality without political action or discourse. Yes, that is very true. In theory, it could, of course. Well, I mean, in theory, anything is possible. But when it comes to, in theory, a benevolent dictator, well, it is worth mentioning that, actually, let's challenge this. How many people do we need in order for a dictatorship to exist?
Hmm.
Can a dictatorship consist of two people or one people or even none?
Hmm.
Any thoughts? How many people do we need for a dictatorship? Virginia says two. Matthew, I don't understand. Mea culpa, I'll take the blame for that. I'm challenging the idea that when it comes to a benevolent dictator could ensure equality without political action. I'm actually curious if politics is even necessary for there to be a benevolent dictator. Naturally, one could think that, say, when it comes to the classical benevolent dictators, say Catherine the Great, Franz Joseph of Austria, we could say that a benevolent dictatorship could require a state in order for that person to be the main authority in the state. But I'm actually trying to challenge it. Is it possible, using Tocqueville's model, that we can have equality established through a benevolent dictatorship without there even being politics involved? Basically, is it possible for a dictatorship to exist without politics?
Hmm.
We have apex predators. We have animals that simply do not have any natural predators that seek them out, that no matter what continent they go to, they are safe from any offense. So we see something akin to that in the animal kingdom. But then the golden eagle and the great white shark, they don't really rule the ocean. You just don't have to answer to anyone. Anyway, something you need to think about as we go forward. So further, in the same chapter, Tocqueville adds, I think that democratic communities have a natural taste for freedom. Left to themselves, they will seek it, cherish it, and view any privation of it with regard. But for equality, their passion is ardent, insatiable, incessant, invincible. They call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality in slavery. They will endure poverty, servitude, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy,
Hmm.
or aristocracy, I should say. Let's think about that. So Virginia writes, I think human beings are not passive and would dispute things enough to require some political structures and processes. And what else do we have over here? Any additional comments? Feel free to unmute yourself if you wish to offer your thoughts vocally. Well, let's actually challenge this. Benjamin Franklin said those who would sacrifice, what was it? Those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither liberty nor security. Let's challenge this a little bit. One message over here. Hi, our vote is power. So one person, one vote. We are invincible. What else do we have over here? That was sent to me by text message. Well, I will challenge one thing when it comes to this. This is very interesting when he talks about how the call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot contain that, they will still call for equality and slavery. Now, that is interesting. I'm going to challenge this. In your opinion, do you think that it is possible for Americans, democracy in America, do you think that it's possible for Americans to willingly enter something akin to slavery in exchange for something?
Idealistically, no.
Mm-hmm. Why not?
Because it's against our basic fiber
Mm-hmm.
of fairness, equality. I don't think we would accept it again in our country.
Well, let's challenge many different kinds of slavery. Now, of course, when it comes to slavery of the bondage of individual people, that was outlawed when it came to the 13th Amendment, with the exception of those who are incarcerated. In your opinion, do you think our prisons in any way are a form of legal slavery. Worth mentioning, it was actually prisons that Tocqueville would have been studying when he came to the United States. Virginia writes, I think people would trade off their power for material goods. All right, that's interesting. All right, so let's think of one thing that we are helpless against. We as American citizens, or even just residents in this country, or even as visitors, we are helpless to certain weapons in this country. This country has several thousand hydrogen bombs. No matter what we do, every single one of them is not able to destroy them. We're not able to create anything akin to it in terms of destructive result. And on top of that, during the Cold War, including up to today, we are in a way helpless at any moment to the consequence of a nuclear exchange between our government and another power. In your opinion, are we truly living free if we are living in a democracy that at any time could be annihilated in a nuclear catastrophe? Basically, does democracy exist in a country with nuclear weapons?
Hmm.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say we still live in a democracy despite the threat of nuclear weapons. I don't quite see the connection there. I mean, we have all sorts of threats. We have threats of hurricanes. We have threats of natural disasters. Why should that impair our liberty?
All right, that is very fair. All right, so when it comes to current threats that we might have right now that are not human, of course, one person is mentioning the president is the sole decider of nuclear weapons. Some additional information over there. But also it is worth mentioning that the president is elected. May not be the perfect system, but we do have people casting votes when it comes to that. Now, let's actually challenge that. When it comes to the potential destruction of, say, COVID, we're living through that right now. Roughly 250,000 died, many more affected, some of them permanently in ways we may not even know the entire consequence of. Now, this has raised a very passionate flag when it comes to how important liberty is when it comes to combating COVID, specifically the right to wear a mask or not. Now, if I'm not mistaken, in New York, we have had laws temporarily in place when it came to using masks. Am I correct when I say that? That we had to publicly wear a mask?
Not that I know of.
All right.
I believe there's a
I believe
mask
so.
mandate.
Yeah, I believe there's a mask mandate. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in New York you can be fined when it comes to not wearing a mask. So let's think about that. Can one enjoy liberty if their liberty is at the expense of someone else? Is that democracy?
This is Gail. We have the stances. You cannot smoke a cigarette indoors. You have to wear a helmet when you ride a motorcycle. Today went into effect backseat seatbelts. So part of the social contract of living with other people is respect for them and voting in people who make laws, and they are there to, I'm not a big fan of people who don't wear masks and say because it infringes on their freedom. I think we have plenty of examples where our social fabric demands freedom in that sense to be limited for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Any other thoughts? All right, well, thank you for offering that one. It does seem that at the end that it seems that possibly cross-culturally, or at the very least across centuries in the United States, so much politics and so many differences in opinion when it comes to politics really do boil down to this joust, so to speak, between equality and liberty, and between the protection and the potential threats when it comes to them. So although it is very fair to say that when Tocqueville is writing this, the United States has already lived through pandemics, smallpox in particular. And not only that, we've also lived through terrible wars. We've lived through the War of 1812, where the White House and Congress was literally put to the flame. So let's move.
Can I just ask though, isn't part of the liberty at that time that if you did not like the rules of where you were living, you would go west, young man?
Yes, that is a liberty. No one was forced to essentially be a resident in their state or territory or even their unsettled territory. That you could go west. That, the United States during this time period was in possession of the Louisiana territory that was essentially stretching across the continent. Any other thoughts? This does raise something interesting when it comes to new frontiers. There has been recently there has been talk on possible settlements in settlements on Earth's moon due to the recent discovery of water there, and of course for the last few years we've been seeing attempts to colonize Mars. I believe it was Musk said that once we start colonizing Mars, we're going to create our own laws there. Maybe that is the new frontier. So I have a question for you. Do you think that these writings on democracy, equality, liberty, do you think that they are applicable, this is going to sound bizarre, on different planets? Or do you think this is solely an Earth applicable theory? Do you believe that equality on Mars is going to mean something very different than equality on Earth? I think it goes without saying that you can't smoke anywhere on Mars because there's only certain places where you can live. And I imagine oxygen supply is going to be very precious over there. So if you are enjoying the liberty of smoking a Camel, it might be at the expense of your oxygen supply. Also, oxygen is extremely flammable. It could set up the entire station, and before you know it, Mars is going back to being a dead planet. Okay, so, all right, so we have some thoughts over here. Matthew, yes, if we get there, it's intercontinental/international influences coming into play. Very interesting. We actually see something very akin to Antarctica right now. That's one very good theory. Another one from Andrew Riley. He's disagreeing with you. He's saying American law should be applied everywhere, especially with respect to pollution. Okay, so let's think about that. The moment that an American lands, all right, so, this is very interesting. The moment that an American lands on the moon, and which did happen, of course, he was able to get there because of the government, and we planted the flag. We now have the flag on Earth's moon. No one has successfully dethroned that of that, but that might happen in the future. If the Chinese are able to send a probe or even astronauts on the moon, they could easily take our flag down, put a different flag up there. Something to be looking forward to in the future. I'm going to be completely honest. Full disclosure, I'm not interested in colonizing other planets or colonizing moons. I want us to be able to mine asteroids. I don't know if you've been reading some of this. They have asteroids out there that are like 30% gold and nickel and tin and all these other minerals. Like, that's the kind of stuff that if we were able to get an asteroid, say if an asteroid was coming towards Earth, instead of blowing it up, if we could somehow almost lasso it into our orbit, we would all be so rich. But that would lead to a different type of inequality, which would probably make for a very interesting discussion in the future on a different subject. But let's get back to the planet Earth.
Well, wait a second. Why don't you expand on that a little bit? If you look at something like Alaska, which is very rich in natural resources. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, I always found that the government there provides a stipend to every naturally born Alaskan for their share of ownership of those resources. So it's sort of a blending of the issue regarding what's in the ground and the people living on the ground having a right to it.
Mm-hmm. No, that is very interesting. And from the few people that I personally known who've lived in Alaska and what they told me, yeah, it is true. If you're in Alaska, you do enjoy some of the material benefits that come from its rich natural resources. It is worth mentioning that as part of the United States, Alaska does not have unlimited rights to, and really the rest of the country doesn't have unlimited rights when it comes to those natural resources. There are parts of Alaska that are conserved, some less now than before. And also there could be consequences when it comes to mining some of the mountains or drilling some of the oil. The Exxon Valdez spill, of course, is a very recent consequence of how one's liberty in Alaska and also the resources in Alaska can ultimately deprive quite a few people of the liberty to enjoy clean water, for example. But so let's see. Since you brought up Alaska, do you have any additional thoughts or just your own point of view on it that you'd like to conclude with?
Well, let me see. I want to think this. I have not traveled a lot, but to some of the other states, like Alaska, that I've been to, or Colorado, there really is a different sense of the American spirit in terms of how laws are formed and whether people have that Wild West or frontier spirit that I think pervades their politics and perhaps their democracy. I'm not saying that in a bad way or in a good way. It's just the culture seems to be very different.
Mm-hmm. I think we can all agree that us New Yorkers are somewhat different from New Jerseyans or Pennsylvanians or Mainers or Massachusetts in probably many ways. That would also make for a very interesting discussion in the future. But no, I mean, when it does come to the idea of American individuality, I mean, this is one thing that we're living through an election year. We've always heard so much about American promise, American ideals, how special Americans are. And then a few days later, we hear the same people who said that going from one state to another, saying, oh, this state is really special. No. Yeah, but that state is very special. And look, we all know that that state is very special, but this state creates the best cheddar in the entire Western Hemisphere.
I think it's interesting that the Western states, what this woman just said before, I think it's interesting to think, why were certain personality types, why did they go to the West? It took a certain person with a spirit of adventure, going on an adventure to settle the West versus the East Coast. We were all pretty much into communities and organizing ourselves in that way. Whereas when you get to these Western states, they do seem more free, maybe the word is free, or they think differently about situations, but I think it's also the type of personalities that go there. The rancher, the farmer, that kind of thinking is going to attract people to a certain area in the country where they can flourish.
If I can add on that completely candidly, just with respect to the Old West, there was another entrepreneurship that did migrate west as well, that played an incredibly consequential role, not only in the creation of some of those states and their constitutions, but whether those constitutions would allow women to vote. And those were prostitutes and madams. They were landowners. They were able to own possessions, their buildings, etc. And they ended up making quite a lot of money as entrepreneurs over in the West. And guess what you do when you have money in a bustling community? You start building schools, you start building libraries, you start financing and contributing to elected officials. And when you have money, you're more likely to support officials whom you agree with. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Colorado or Wyoming. My instinct tells me it was Wyoming, that so many of these states actually had women's suffrage before they were allowed into the United States. And I believe it was Wyoming made it very clear that they would not join the United States unless their women were able to vote. And if any of you are interested, during the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, you can see some of these maps of states that already had women's suffrage. And the lion's share of them are over in the far west. And it was really because of that opportunity of going west and really not only starting life anew, but basically starting the idea of equality anew with these new territories and these new states. And naturally, subject of fantastic writing. Very good book that came out last year on the subject. It's Votes for Women, again from Princeton University Press. Beautifully illustrated book, I have to say, and it had very good essays from very different perspectives when it came to women's suffrage in the United States. If anyone is interested, Votes for Women from Princeton University Press last year. So on individualism, continuing, Tocqueville writes, I have shown how it is that in ages of equality, every man seeks for his opinions within himself. I am now about to show how it is that in the same ages, all his feelings are turned towards himself alone. Egotism blights the germ of all virtue. Individualism at first only saps the virtues of public life, but in the long run, it attacks and destroys all others, and in the length absorbed is downright egotism. Egotism is a vice as old as the world, which does not belong in one form of society more than another. Individualism is of democratic origin, and it threatens to spread in the same ratio as the equality of conditions. Any thoughts on that? You have the floor. Yes, one comment from Matthew, adding to what Andrew was writing, no sarcasm. If labor laws applied everywhere, there would be a lot less offshoring. Matthew agreeing with him, of course. Let's think about it. In your opinion, when does American individuality become American egoism?
Can you repeat that, Giacomo? When does
American individuality become egotism?
Hmm.
Well, let's challenge that. I mean, you do have to be egotistic if you're going to seek public office. I mean, you're willing to wager that you could represent an entire population better than anyone else. You even might be casting a vote for yourself. Interesting question. Do you consider voting a form of egotism?
No,
Why not?
I think it's more individualism. I
How
have
so?
the right to express my point of view and join a greater collective that will be counted on election day. But it is not I think of egotism as it's my point of view that must prevail, and only I know what's right.
But you raise a very interesting point. While I do agree with you, I mean, ultimately, voting is a form of public participation. You are choosing to be a part of the republic, of the democracy. In a way, the more people that are voting, we could say the less powerful the people that are being elected are, because there's so many people who are now a part of the system that could change the leadership. Is it possible to vote egotistically?
Only for yourself.
Okay. Anyone agree or disagree?
I think you can vote egotistically if you only put your own self-centered needs above society. So if the only reason I'm going to vote is because of the impact of the economy on my 401k, that would be egotistical voting. If I don't come from that framework and I balance out my family's needs versus society's needs, then I'm more participating in a democracy, not from an egotistic point of view.
All right. Does anybody feel, oh yes, we have a comment over here from Matthew and also from Andrew. So Andrew writes, what of the wisdom of the crowd, an assembly of individual egotistic opinions? How can this be a vice? Also from Matthew. I'm sorry, the previous one was from Andrew. Matthew writes, yes, if you are ignoring the collective, but there's so much talk about people voting against their interests, like that is a bad thing. And Christian writes, there are so many single issue voters. I mean, we're going to be able to see that tomorrow when it comes to some of the exit polls, the most crucial basically the most important thing that people are voting on. So let's see what we have over here. I chose this for discussion. Not only does democracy make every man forget his ancestors, but also clouds their view of their descendants and isolates them from their contemporaries. Each man is forever thrown back in himself alone, and there is danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. I have a question. In your opinion, when it comes to Tocqueville, every now and then we can hear his love for aristocracy in the back of his writings.
Mhm.
In your opinion, do you think that he is writing this as a nostalgic way of showcasing some of the virtues of an aristocracy, which do not become clouded or die out, that continue to endure? Or in your opinion, do you think that this is a defect in democracy? Does democracy make us short-sighted?
I think it's very French.
Please expand upon that.
Well, the way he words it, I think it's a reflection of his own life, own growing up. And where's the part of it that made me think? Well, that was my take when I read it. This sounds like a Frenchman talking about the Aristotle type of environment that went on in France.
Thank you so much for that. Matthew writes, absolutely. Matthew, if you have a microphone, would you mind muting yourself and expanding upon that? I'm sorry, unmuting yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, I think what I have read, and I haven't read the entire book, and having lived in France for 6 years, I think I definitely hear some French aristocracy coming through. He puts a very critical eye on democracy, which is often astute and deserved. And I think it would be impossible for him, especially at that time, to have come here and not have been influenced by his background and be constantly presenting his thoughts from the perspective of a French aristocrat.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I have a question. In your opinion, as someone who has lived in France, would you mind letting us know that today, do you feel that America or France is more aristocratic?
That's a tough question. It really is, because I lived in a part of, I was in Paris, and not only just in Paris, but in the arrondissement, where a lot of the expats and embassies and wealthier Parisians lived. So there was a certain aura there that, I don't want to say too much without not saying anything. I think I think both countries still suffer from inequality and all the negative feelings that come from that. I wouldn't presume to really know if one is greater than the other.
No, it's no problem. Thank you very much for offering that. All I have personally seen of France outside of the textbooks was Charles de Gaulle International Airport. I was supposed to be spending a honeymoon over there during the early summer of 2020, but I guess it got 2020'd. Something to look forward to in the future.
Yes. Well, I can give you a couple pointers if you care to follow up.
Listen, you have my email on the syllabus. My wife would love to hear whatever inside information you had for us so that we can enjoy the best possible time when we do this. Thank you very much. So now this, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew, this was part of what you sent me in your email. Despotism, which is of a very timorous nature, is never more secure of, Kristen, can you please read this? I'm so tongue-tied right now.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Despotism, which is of a very timorous nature, is never more secure of continuance than when it can keep men asunder. And all is influence is commonly exerted for that purpose. A despot easily forgives his subjects for not loving him, provided they do not love each other. Despotism then, which is at all times dangerous, is more particularly to be feared in democratic ages.
Thank you very much. It's worth mentioning what he says over here is when it comes to a despot easily forgives his subjects for not loving him. This is straight out of Niccolo Machiavelli. I don't know if it's a direct quote. I don't know if Tocqueville read Machiavelli. I'm assuming that he did. He likely spoke Italian or would have had access to writings on Machiavelli. But yeah, this is straight out of Niccolo Machiavelli. This is political philosophy that is timeless across millennia and continents. But when it comes to the end, despotism then, which is at all times dangerous, is particularly to be feared in the democratic ages. Now, make no mistake, he is writing this as someone who saw the French Revolution lead to Napoleon. There's no doubt about that. He's constantly going back on France, reflecting on French history, the French aristocrats. There's no way he can talk about French democracy or democracy in general without thinking about Napoleon. And when it comes to the United States, during the time that he was visiting the United States, he would have been arriving in the United States at a time when Andrew Jackson was simultaneously being praised as the greatest president since George Washington, and as someone who was, by his critics, considered an autocrat. So let's think about this. In your opinion, do you think that despotism is, and let me correct that. In your opinion, do you think that democracies are particularly vulnerable to despotism? Or do you think that despotism is something that could threaten any type of government?
I'm sorry, Giacomo, did you say I missed the last end. Despotism could threaten any?
Could threaten any government.
Yeah, I would say it could threaten any, and I don't know that democracy is particularly vulnerable, and perhaps even less so.
Mm-hmm. Susan writes, this section proves that autocracy requires more than one person. It requires one person plus a loyal army. Excellent. This is part of the reason why we see so many military dictatorships around the world. Some of them either taking the place of a democracy or a republic, or in other cases, breaking free from a larger government. Something else that we could be thinking about when it comes to despotism in democracies is we could be, from Tocqueville's point of view, when it does come to the aristocrats, it's a much smaller pool of people, some might say a smaller pool of talent. While this may not be able to, say, field individuals for leadership who may be the best generals, the best leaders, the most intellectual thinkers, it also limits the possibility that some of them might be autocrats. When it came to Adolf Hitler, for example, he was without a doubt not part of the aristocracy of Kaiser Wilhelm or anything like that in the German Empire. Hitler possibly could have only come to power in a republic because he tried to become an autocrat using a coup d'etat, and it resulted in him being arrested. So let's think about that. In the United States, do you think that we are vulnerable in the United States? Do you think we are more vulnerable to despotism the more democratic we become?
No, I don't see that. I think we have the Constitution is strong enough to protect us from despotism.
Mm-hmm. So, in your opinion, John Adams was wrong when he said that women playing more of a role in government would lead to a tyranny of the petticoat? Matthew writes, I don't think so. We have the three branches of government. Yeah, we value the three branches of government too highly. Something to think about, because we have been hearing quite a lot of opinions on this in some very different point of views over the last 24 hours, and like we will continue to. So the passage over here, we are approaching the end, so I'm going to have this be the final thing we discuss today. When it comes to free institutions, Tocqueville writes, in order to combat the evils which equality may produce, there is only one effectual remedy, namely political freedom. So freedom is essential to protect against some of the dangers equality may produce. Now, if some of you are interested, some of you might be asking, well, what evil can come of equality? Equality sounds like a wonderful thing. Equal opportunity, equal liberty, etc. It sounds like the two go together. There was a book by Kurt Vonnegut called Welcome to the Monkey House, which I'm sure the library has if anyone wants to take it out. And there's a short story in there called Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. Has anyone ever heard of Harrison Bergeron? If you have, please say yes. Kristen, I see you nodding your head. Are you familiar with it enough to give us a summary of the role that equality plays in Harrison Bergeron? You're muted, you're muted.
You know, I'm not, but I just checked out a book by Kurt Vonnegut, and it's actually, I know that it's widely used short story, so I was looking forward to reading it, but no, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the themes of it.
No problem, no problem. I'm happy to summarize. In Harrison Bergeron, it takes place in a future where I believe over 100 amendments have been added to the US Constitution, and they primarily focus on equality. Now, as a result, this is a future where we see what Kurt Vonnegut presents as equality gone mad. People who are taller than other people have to wear heavy weights that make them hunker down, so no one is taller than anyone else. People who are highly intelligent have to wear special earpieces that blast their eardrums with loud sound so that they cannot make complex thoughts. People are not allowed to become more gifted in music or the arts than anybody else. So if you listen to a symphony, everyone plays the instruments about as well as someone who hasn't been trained in it. So he does show over there, at least fantastically in a work of science fiction, that there can be evil when it comes to equality. And it is without a doubt the story itself is horrifying. It's two parents watching their incredibly strong, handsome, tall son, Harrison, basically being murdered on live TV for trying to start an uprising. And yeah, going through here, yeah, since we are going to be wrapping up a little bit earlier, I guess I will stop on this particular one. I am sorry, we are going to be wrapping things up a little bit early. I have another commitment that I have to go to that I wasn't able to reschedule. But are there any final thoughts or words before we pass for tonight's discussion?
You have mentioned several books, and I'm wondering if Kristen might put them together for us, and so we could take a look at and read some of them.
Happily, yes. Kristen, the books that I mentioned were The Decline and Rise of Democracy by David Stethevage, and the other was Votes for Women. Both books were from Princeton University Press, published within the last 1 or 2 years. Anyone else?
Vote tomorrow.
I guess we'll leave on that note. Thank you all for your time and for your questions. Just one final comment here from Matthew: equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. Again, everyone, thank you so much for everything that you offered. We will see you next week for our final discussion. In the meantime, Make sure that we're still a democracy by voting. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.